There was a time when Criss Angel was impossible to ignore. He was on your television screen, plastered across billboards in Las Vegas, and at the center of conversations about what magic could actually be. He walked on water. He levitated between buildings. He let himself be run over while lying on broken glass. He was not just a magician performing tricks. He was a force that made millions of people stop and question what they were seeing. And then, slowly, something shifted. He didn't vanish overnight, and there was no dramatic farewell. He simply became less present, less urgent, less everywhere. And when people noticed, they started asking the same question. What happened to Criss Angel? The answer is not what most people expect, and it has very little to do with magic. Before the fame, before the Vegas residency, before any of the television spectacles that made him a household name, he was just a kid named Christopher Sarantakos growing up on Long Island. He discovered magic at 7 years old, and from the very beginning, it wasn't a casual interest. He described it as a feeling of power, a way of understanding something that the adults around him simply could not. That feeling stuck with him in a way that most childhood obsessions never do. By the time he was 12, he had already performed his first paid show, earning $10 for it. It wasn't much, but it was proof that magic could be more than a fascination. It could be a livelihood. By 14, he was performing regularly in local restaurants, making up to $100 a night in tips. For a teenager, that kind of early success plants a very specific belief, that the traditional path isn't necessary. His family didn't see it that way. His parents hoped he would go to college, find a stable profession, and build a predictable life. The idea of becoming a full-time magician seemed not just unrealistic to them, but genuinely risky. He disagreed, and he disagreed loudly enough to act on it. He left behind the conventional road entirely, joining traveling performance acts and spending hours in public libraries, teaching himself the history of illusion. He explored music, martial arts, mysticism, and performance techniques, not because someone guided him there, but because he was deliberately building something that didn't look like anyone else's career. He made a conscious decision not to learn too closely from other magicians. He didn't want to think like them. He wanted to create something darker, more personal, and more intense. That decision became the entire foundation of who he would become. By the time he started making early television appearances and working with figures like Clive Barker, it was already clear that he wasn't trying to slot himself into the traditional image of a magician. He was constructing a brand that blurred the lines between illusion, performance art, and sheer spectacle. What made that brand so powerful was also what made it inherently fragile, because everything he was building depended on one thing: control. Control over performance, control over the narrative, control over how the world saw him. And for a long time, that control held. When Criss Angel Mindfreak launched, it wasn't just another magic show. It was a deliberate reinvention of what magic could look like on television. He wasn't performing in a controlled theater with velvet curtains and a polite audience. He was taking illusions into public spaces, reacting to real crowds, and executing stunts that felt genuinely dangerous because, in many cases, they were. He was a creator, director, and executive producer, which meant the control he had always craved was baked into the structure of the show itself. The format worked. The scale of his illusions escalated rapidly, and so did the audience. The show eventually became the highest-rated program on A&E, drawing over 1.5 million viewers, and Criss Angel stopped being just a name in the magic community and became a mainstream cultural figure. The success pushed him further. He partnered with Cirque du Soleil to create Criss Angel Believe, a Las Vegas production backed by an enormous investment and positioned as one of the most ambitious magic shows ever staged. The initial reception was complicated. Critics felt the production leaned too heavily on narrative and abstract spectacle, losing the raw energy that had made him compelling in the first place. Adjustments were made. The show was reworked to center more directly on illusions, and it eventually became one of the best-selling magic productions in the city, generating tens of millions in ticket revenue. But even that success came with a cost. Maintaining a top-rated television show while simultaneously running a major live production in Las Vegas meant there was no room to slow down. Every stunt had to be bigger than the last. Every performance had to justify the one before it. The pressure didn't ease as the success grew. It multiplied. He was no longer competing with other magicians. He was competing with his own legacy. During this period, the cracks started to become visible. Reports of volatile temper, public confrontations, and a carefully cultivated bad boy image added complexity to how people perceived him. Some fans were drawn to that intensity. Others began to sense an imbalance between the persona being projected and the person living inside it. The drive that carried him from a Long Island kid with $10 and a dream to one of the most recognized names in Las Vegas was the same drive that was making everything harder to sustain. From the outside, it looked like he had everything. From the inside, the weight of maintaining that image was becoming something else entirely. And then something happened that no illusion, no preparation, and no amount of control could have prevented. His young son, Johnny Christopher, was diagnosed with leukemia before he had even reached his second birthday. Everything that came after that moment needs to be understood in light of that fact. The man who had spent his entire career engineering outcomes, manufacturing the appearance of the impossible, and maintaining absolute command over his public image was suddenly confronted with something that could not be managed or controlled or reversed through skill or discipline. His son had cancer, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. The structure of his life changed immediately. Hospital visits replaced production schedules. Treatment plans replaced stunt planning. Chemotherapy became a constant presence, bringing with it the kind of side effects that are brutal to witness in a child. Mood swings driven by steroid medications, personality changes that didn't reflect who Johnny actually was, visible suffering that stretched across not weeks but years. Angel spoke openly about watching his son go through those changes, describing the emotional weight of knowing the treatments were necessary, while also watching what they did. He admitted to feeling something he had almost never felt before in his life: completely helpless. That word, helpless, had no place in the vocabulary of someone who had built a career on the illusion of total control. And yet there it was. He said openly that he would have taken his son's place if it were possible. That kind of statement doesn't come from someone performing grief for an audience. It comes from someone who has been sitting in hospital rooms long enough to mean every word. After years of treatment, Johnny reached remission, and for a moment there was relief. Then the cancer returned. The family went back into the same cycle of hospitalizations, uncertainty, and relentless treatment before Johnny was readmitted for another round. Angel took him to theme parks, Disneyland and Universal Studios, not as a publicity moment, but as a father trying to give his son normal days before the hard ones came back. Those are not the choices of someone managing a brand. Those are the choices of a parent. Throughout that entire period, Angel began using his platform in a way that had nothing to do with magic. He started speaking directly about pediatric cancer, sharing his family's experience without the filter of performance or image management. He organized fundraising efforts aimed at raising millions of dollars for research and support. He produced a film called 1095, the number referring to the exact number of chemotherapy sessions his son endured. The film was not made to entertain. It was made to show the unedited reality of what pediatric cancer looks like behind the statistics, and to push people toward taking the issue seriously. He made the point that one child is diagnosed with cancer every 2 minutes, and he said it not as a talking point, but as someone who had lived inside that statistic for years. He also said something that would have seemed almost impossible to imagine from the version of him that dominated television screens in the mid-2000s. He said he would rather be remembered for what he did to help children with cancer than for anything he accomplished as a magician. That is not a small statement from someone who spent decades building one of the most recognizable careers in the history of his craft. It is a complete redefinition of what success means, and it didn't come from a branding meeting or a publicist's advice. It came from years of sitting with a reality that had nothing to do with performance. His personal life reflected that same shift. His long-term relationship with Shauna Benson, which had its difficult periods, became anchored in the shared experience of raising their children through everything they had faced. Their family grew, but the years spent fighting for Johnny remained the experience that shaped how they approached everything else. Financially, Angel continued to generate substantial revenue, with business ventures running into tens of millions annually. But the role that money played in his public narrative changed. It became less about demonstrating success and more about creating the independence to do things on his own terms, to support causes that mattered, to choose when to perform and what to say yes to. His live show in Las Vegas continued to run, eventually evolving into Mindfreak Live at Planet Hollywood, and it drew consistent crowds. But the constant need to dominate television, to engineer viral moments, to stay in perpetual competition with his own past, that need was gone. Not because the career had declined, but because his priorities had moved somewhere else entirely. The most important things in his life were happening off the stage, and no amount of camera time was worth pulling focus away from them. When Johnny finally rang the bell signaling the end of his chemotherapy, more than 5 years after the original diagnosis, the moment wasn't filmed as performance. It wasn't staged for maximum emotional impact or packaged as content. It was simply a family moment that happened to carry the weight of everything they had been through. And the man standing there watching his son ring that bell was not the same person who had once built an entire identity around never showing weakness, never losing control, and never letting the audience see behind the curtain. What changed Criss Angel was not a failed show or a public controversy or the natural fade that catches up with most celebrities eventually. What changed him was becoming a father who watched his child fight for his life and came out the other side with a completely different understanding of what any of it is worth. The performances still happen. The name still carries weight. But the urgency is different now, quieter and more deliberate, rooted in something that cannot be replicated on a stage or captured in a television special. He didn't disappear. He just stopped needing you to see him. And for someone who once built everything on being impossible to look away from, that might be the most remarkable transformation he has ever pulled off.